The number one priority of Republican state officials, particularly state legislatures across the country right now, aside from targeting trans folks and banning abortion, is to subvert democratic accountability. And in some states, they are attacking democracy precisely so they can ban abortion. For instance, Ohio. That is where Republican lawmakers are trying to make an end run around abortion rights supporters who are working to place a constitutional amendment on the ballot in November to guarantee the right to abortion. The opponents of that are pushing their own ballot initiative that would make it far harder to get such amendments passed, increasing the required threshold from a simple majority votes to 60%. And not only that, get this, the plan is to rush that measure, the one that raises the threshold, onto the ballot in August, right, in the dead of summer, low turnout, so they can head off the abortion rights referendum in November. That proposed change is so divisive, it drew hundreds of protesters to Ohio State House today, even has some Republican lawmakers concerned. A version of Ohio's attack on democracy is also happening in Texas. The Republican-led legislature there is advancing a bill that would allow the Secretary of State, appointed by the Republican governor, to, get this, just throw out election results in polling locations that run out of ballot paper. And here's the rub. The measure applies only to counties with at least 2.7 million people. There is only one county meeting this criteria, the overwhelmingly Democratic Harris County, home to Houston, which means a Republican Secretary of State would have unilateral power to throw out an election in the state's largest county and one of its most Democratic. There's also North Carolina. You've got a Democratic governor there, but the newly elected Republican majority on the state Supreme Court just reversed that court's own decision from just last year to allow aggressive partisan gerrymandering, a move that one of the two dissenting state justices derided as lawless and a, quote, shameful manipulation of fundamental principles of our democracy and rule of law. But while state Republicans work to rig democracy in their favor or to subvert the popular will of the people, one of the people who's been most active in fighting against these moves around the country is former U.S. Attorney General under President Obama, Eric Holder. Eric Holder now chairs the National Democratic Redistricting Committee, and he joins me here tonight. It's good to have you on, Mr. Holder. I know that you have been very active in North Carolina, and North Carolina really seems like a wild and special case where you have a state that's pretty close. It's a 52-48 state. It's got a Democratic governor elected statewide twice, super majorities in the state legislature of Republicans. How did this happen, and what does it mean now that they've been given the green light to gerrymander even more aggressively?
Well, I think it means that democracy is at risk in North Carolina, as it is really around this country in the ways that you have just described. I mean, what happened in North Carolina was that there was a judicial election, and the composition of the court changed. You now have more Republicans than Democrats on the Supreme Court. And this new Supreme Court overturned a Supreme Court decision from just a few months ago that will now allow partisan gerrymandering to occur in North Carolina, a place with a supermajority of Republicans. And you know what's going to happen. I mean, this supermajority of Republican legislature is going to come up with districts that will favor, in an inappropriate way, they will gerrymander on a partisan and racial basis to guarantee that they can continue to control the North Carolina legislature. What the North Carolina Supreme Court did was not based on principle. It was not based on precedent, as courts are supposed to do. It was based on personnel, the change in personnel. Yes. And it puts democracy at risk.
We've seen these kind of doom loops, right? And Wisconsin's a sort of interesting comparison place, right? Wisconsin's sort of the other state where if you look at statewide elections as a competitive state, it's not like a deeply conservative Republican state. You get 50-50 elections, you got a Democratic governor, and yet the gerrymander the state Republican legislature came up with sort of barricades them in against democratic accountability. There, the election of a Democrat to that Supreme Court seems to sort of augur in the opposite direction in terms of unwinding that doom loop. How do you see the way out of this kind of suffocation from these sort of super majorities that are gerrymandered into place in states like this?
It's a really difficult thing. You know, voter suppression is one thing, and that is something that I've worked against, something that I stand against. But if people have to wait in line 4 hours, if they have to get photo ID, that's something that people can do. It is extremely difficult to overcome a well-constructed partisan or racial gerrymander. Now, you would always look to the courts. whether it is to the Supreme Court in the state, lower courts in the states, to say that, the gerrymander that has been put in place is unconstitutional when one looks at the state's constitution. In North Carolina, what they've essentially done is to say, all right, we're going to allow this gerrymandered legislature to keep itself in power, and we're not going to have any control over that legislature because we're going to allow this newly conformed Supreme Court to essentially rubber stamp that which they are going to do. So we have to win elections to the extent that we possibly can. People have to be engaged in this. And progressives and Democrats have to play the long game. This is not something that it can be episodic. If we want to have democracy, we have to do democracy. It means we have to vote. We have to organize. We have to get people focused on these issues like partisan and racial gerrymandering, which we've not really focused on to the degree that I think we should have.
Yeah, I mean, I think, one of the things you saw in the Wisconsin election was an unprecedented mobilization around a Supreme Court race, precisely because people understood the stakes. I want to ask you, one of the things that really sticks out to me, let's talk about this Texas example, because I find myself deeply and viscerally offended by the evident bad faith and pretextual nature of this, right? So you've got a state legislature that says cities that are 2.7 million counties that are 2.7 million or greater are going to be subject to this new rule. Now, it turns out the second largest county in the state is 2.6 million. Okay? So what this is obviously we are going after Democratic Harris County, and we're going to give our Republican dude the ability to wave a magic wand and invalidate an election under this preposterous pretextual threshold. And I feel like we see this in more and more places cropping up. And it just seems to me like wildly offensive as a matter of like democratic equality.
Sure, it's obviously offensive. It's blatant. The Republicans have made peace with the notion that in terms of popular support, they're going to be a minority party that will exercise majority power. And they're okay with that. A political apartheid system is something that they're comfortable with. They see the changing demographics in this country. They see a changing America. They see young people who are not supportive of the policies that they have in place. And that was, I was in Wisconsin during that Supreme Court election. And to see the huge numbers of young people going to the polls and voting in college campuses and other places, and women coming to the polls, supporters of women, all voting against that which Republicans are trying to do when it comes to reproductive rights, but also when it comes to, gun safety, when it comes to criminal justice reform, a whole range of issues. Republicans are doing things that are inconsistent with the desires of the people who they supposedly want to represent. Republicans are afraid of the people. They are afraid to go to the people with their policies. And I think you have to ask yourself, what does the Republican Party stand for now on a national level or on a state level? Well, they cater to the special interests. They cater to the extremists. They don't do the kinds of things or come up with the kinds of policies that will help the average American do better in life, either economically, socially, and they certainly don't want to help the average American when it comes to being better politically.
Yeah, I mean, what's striking to me, too, is just the kind of sense of sort of paranoia here, right? I mean, in the case of North Carolina and Wisconsin, right, these are closely divided states. They have close statewide elections, whether the statewide elections or presidential elections, right? They're contested. Abbott won by 11 points. His approval rating's pretty high. Texas remains a fairly Republican state. It's not like they hold every statewide office. The Democrats in the state of Mormon, you don't actually have to do this, right? I mean, it's a bizarre confession of insecurity that you're going to do this to Harris County when it's not like you can't just on the merits win elections in Texas. In fact, that's all they do with statewide elections in Texas.
Sure, but they don't even want to run the risk that they might lose an election. And so they gerrymander a system or suppress the vote so that those margins that the governor, that Abbott ran up, probably not as high as they actually are, given the fact that Texas is the hardest state in the country to cast a vote. Yep. And so if you didn't have those restrictions in place, those margins would probably be a little lower. But that shows the bankruptcy of that party. They are so concerned with just losing an election, they're willing to put at risk their reputation, their place in history, simply so that they win. Yeah. And again, this is all about the acquisition and the retention of power at all costs.
former Attorney General Eric Holder. Thank you so much for making some time with us. I appreciate it. That is all in on this Wednesday night. Alex Wagner tonight starts right now with my good